Somewhat, I don't know, nervous about saying anything about the modern history of Afghanistan because it's very hard to find accurate information. Because I think everybody who's writing about it right now has a definite agenda that they're a narrative that they're trying to tell. But try to give some idea of what's going on. So we're going to talk about the American intervention, 2001 to the present. Again, this is where we're at. Pretty much from 2001 until the present, the lines haven't changed very much, if at all. So these Pakistan's lines, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all those created in the 80s and 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed. But pretty much that's how it's been since we've been involved there. This is kind of how we left it off, a map of Afghanistan. Last time, this is the political situation in October 2001, just before 9/11. The Taliban controlling everything except what's in the red here. The red being controlled by the Northern Alliance under Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was a commander against the Soviets. So pretty much the Taliban from like 1994, 95 to like 96, 97 took over Afghanistan in like 2 years. It was nobody saw it coming. Basically, if you remember what happened was after the Soviets pulled out, most world powers stopped taking an interest in Afghanistan, and the whole thing kind of disintegrated into all the different commanders who had been fighting the Soviets just started setting up their own little areas of control. So to travel through, you had to go through checkpoints every few miles, pay your dues to whoever local commander was controlling that area so you wouldn't get killed.
I say that's not all that unusual in non-Western democracy. I read about David Livingston. The biggest problems he had traveling through Africa was every little spot there was some kind of a commander guy who was going to charge you money to come through.
Yep. So Pakistan, one of the two biggest players were Massoud and Hekmatyar. And Hekmatyar was the Pakistani favorite. He was a hardline Islamist, and they wanted to see his government established. Problem was, Massoud managed to get to Kabul first, and he was a good enough military commander, much better than Hekmatyar, that he managed to hold on in spite of the fact that he was getting no outside aid. So that was pretty much the situation that the Taliban came into, and they very quickly took over. The Pakistani authorities got discouraged with Hekmatyar and switched their support to the Taliban, and that was their new plan for stabilizing Afghanistan as a good ally to Pakistan. So, from a social standpoint, the Taliban were a hardline Islamic group, and they did all kinds of social reforms. Just a couple examples: wearing Western clothes was banned. Men who trimmed their beards were punished by whipping. Radio Kabul became Radio Sharia. Television was outlawed entirely. Couldn't watch anything. And I believe Radio Kabul was the only radio that was allowed as Radio Sharia. Women were not allowed to work or receive medical aid from male doctors, and that was a real problem because there weren't hardly any female doctors. So basically, that ended up being women couldn't get medical aid. In places, the Taliban went house to house, smashing televisions, radios, wine bottles, anything that they were against, The Taliban was extremely brutal in their social reforms, but because they were not corrupt, travel became safer, and foreign agencies actually had an easier time operating if they could operate without women. That was one of the troubles that they had. But the security situation in Afghanistan actually got better, even though if you didn't like the social reforms, you know, you had that problem. But if you wanted to just travel, you know, from Pakistan's point of view, getting, you know, convoys or whatever from Uzbekistan or something like that became possible again under the Taliban. So then, I want to also back up a little bit and talk about Osama bin Laden. I'm sure everyone's heard of him. Bin Laden was a wealthy Saudi prince. His family became wealthy doing large construction projects for the Saudi royal family. During the Soviet era, he spent a lot of time in Afghanistan funding mujahideen and overseeing construction projects, though he did little, if any, fighting. And this is one of the myths. Bin Laden was very good at creating myths about himself, and one of those was that he was a great rebel fighter. But it's well documented that he did very little, if any, actual fighting at this point in his life. He was a financier, not an operative. When Saudi Arabia, after the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan, the next major conflict was the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. So when Saudi Arabia allowed U.S. troops to operate within its borders, and at the same time they rejected an offer from bin Laden to lead a jihad against Saddam Hussein, bin Laden began to criticize the royal family and soon got himself exiled from Saudi Arabia. So he thought that they shouldn't take Western aid and allow Western troops in Saudi Arabia, and instead he wanted to organize a Muslim jihad. But Saudi Arabia probably correctly realized that that wouldn't have worked very well. Bin Laden set up his base in Sudan in 1992, where he came under the watch of the CIA for the first time. And over the next 4 years, from 92 to 96, the CIA slowly began to identify him as a significant leader of global terrorism. And over this time, he started to make a shift from being just a financier to an actual operative, and they started to document transactions where he's buying guns and other assembling more fighters directly under his control. And it just started to have more of an impression of him as an operative rather than a financier. Yeah.
When he worked with Mujahideen, was he a CIA operative at that point?
No.
I mean, there's this myth or this idea that bin Laden is a CIA creator.
Mm-hmm. Not according to my research. There is debate over whether he was affiliated with the Saudi Arabia's intelligence service. Some people think that there's evidence that maybe he was, but other evidence that he probably wasn't. So I haven't seen any evidence that he was a CIA operative at all. So in 1996, Saddam expelled bin Laden, probably in an attempt to gain favor with the USA. He flew to Afghanistan, where he still had plenty of friends from the Soviet era. So the United States had complained to Saddam a couple times about bin Laden's activities, and eventually they decided that it would just be a good idea to get rid of him so that to try to have better relations with the United States. In 1998, following the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, President Clinton gave the first authorization to capture or kill bin Laden. So the first time he was named as someone to kill. Who here remembers the bombings in Kenya and Tanzania embassies? I was too young to remember that. So then, so he's in Afghanistan. Shortly after the embassy bombings, the U.S. did cruise missile strikes on a valley in Afghanistan where bin Laden was thought to be holding meetings. It seems that more helped him than it didn't kill him, and it probably helped him more than anything because it gave him the image of being a global, enemy of the United States.
U.S. domestic politics going on at the time, the Monica Lewinsky affair
Right.
was in the news, and to overseas.
Mhm.
So it was unsuccessful, but nobody really expected it to be successful.
That's certainly true. That it was, according to some of the things I've read, Pakistani intelligence knew about it. Everybody knew about it before it happened, and it's almost inconceivable that Bin Laden didn't know about it before it happened. But it was a publicity thing. It was, a public retaliation for the bombings, and also possibly a good way of diverting some attention away from home. So tracking Bin Laden in a country where there was no U.S. embassy and barely any U.S. citizens proved to be very difficult. A few of the things that the CIA tried was, for one, keeping in touch with Massoud, giving him surveillance equipment. But that was difficult because he was up north, Bin Laden was in the south. It didn't work very well. They also equipped a snatch and grab team with Pakistan in conjunction with their intelligence. The idea being if they could get a good location, this team could go in and get him. That kind of fell apart because Pakistan then used that team for other things rather than for Bin Laden. They even used an early surveillance drone based in Uzbekistan. It was one of the first uses of a surveillance drone ever. It was based out of Uzbekistan and flown from the United States. As far as Bin Laden and the Taliban, U.S. officials also tried to pressure the Taliban into handing over Bin Laden in return for recognition as the government. Some things like that were tried. Bin Laden supplied funding to the Taliban and also supplied fighters in the continued war with Massoud. He was actually quite valuable. His Arab fighters were very valuable in fighting against Massoud's Tajiks. The Taliban, of course, being predominantly Pushtun. Many Taliban leaders agreed with the jihad against America, and it became increasingly obvious that the Taliban had no interest in cooperating on the Bin Laden issue. But over this time, up until when the Soviets left until America, until 9/11, pretty much America was non-interventionist in Afghanistan. It refused to support any party. Really, the main people that were supporting different factions was Pakistan supporting the Taliban, Iran and India in a small amount supporting the Northern Alliance. So on September 2001, on September 9th, two al-Qaeda operatives, al-Qaeda being Bin Laden's organization, posed as journalists, managed to secure an interview with Massoud, and they detonated a bomb concealed in a camera, killing Massoud and throwing the Northern Alliance into panic. 2 days later, the World Trade Center was attacked, killing almost 3,000 Americans. There's no evidence that the Taliban had prior knowledge of either of these attacks. From what I've been, the research that I've been able to do, it appears that the Taliban did not know that this was afoot. America's response then, Bin Laden immediately claimed responsibility, and President Bush issued the Taliban an ultimatum: immediately hand over Bin Laden or face war, basically. Now, it's unlikely that the Taliban could have captured Bin Laden even if they'd wanted to. Bin Laden was heavily dug in by that time, and he had a lot of very heavily armed Arab fighters. It would have been extremely dangerous to open a second front against the Arab Mujahideen. So for the Taliban to attack Bin Laden would have given them a two-front war, one against the Tajiks and one against the Arabs. And that could have been very disastrous for them. So as Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, stalled, America was already preparing for a massive invasion. So basically the argument, the public argument of President Bush was that the Taliban is harboring Bin Laden and refusing to give him over, so we're justified in taking out the Taliban. So that brings us to Operation Enduring Freedom. So by mid-October, so about a month after 9/11, American bombs and missiles began to pound Taliban and al-Qaeda positions. At the same time, America began to give large quantities of military aid to the Northern Alliance. Everything from rockets to tanks, everything. American Special Forces and CIA operatives began to operate in conjunction with anyone who was against the Taliban, basically. And interestingly, just as one example of the way that American politics has operated in Afghanistan, one of the guys that the U.S. started giving weapons and supporting was Hekmatyar, the old nemesis of Massoud. Now, a few years later, he fell out of favor because he didn't get a role in the new government. So he started then an insurgency against the government and was then put on the United States terrorist list, so someone we wanted to kill. Just recently, he made a deal with the government of Afghanistan, and now he's back off the terrorist list. And this is the same guy who's had all kinds of atrocities. He was the same guy who launched a huge rocket attack on Kabul, killing thousands of civilians when he was fighting Massoud. There's no morality to this, the way this is being handled. It's political expediency. With overwhelming air support, the Northern Alliance very quickly retook Kabul in November and Kandahar in December. By the early 2002, the Taliban had been, as an organization in Afghanistan, was in just a shadow of what it was. There was, with American air support, the Taliban really could not compete against the Northern Alliance. So then, meanwhile, the United Nations was scrambling to create a political solution to replace the Taliban. Now you might think, maybe this is something we should have thought about before we decided to overthrow the Taliban, but actually, there was only a month between 9/11 and when the attack started, so there was no time. It was an afterthought of what are we going to do after the Taliban are gone. So the Bonn Agreement created a provisional 6-month government, after which a Loya Jirga would convene to elect a transition government. That Loya Jirga is basically like a national convention. The idea was to have a big meeting to try to legitimize a transition government. And then national elections were scheduled for 2004. So it was like a 3-step process to arrive at a legitimate new government. The Bonn Agreement was essentially a rehash of the pre-Taliban power-sharing agreements. Power was divided up between the Peshawar Mujahideen, guys like Hekmatyar, and the Northern Alliance and the Royalists. And the Royalists were guys who were connected with the last king of Afghanistan, Zaire Shah, from before the Soviets. So there was still his group around as well. So they basically divided up power among those 3 groups. It's basically the same thing that they tried to do in the era between the Soviets and the Taliban. It didn't work then, but there was no solution of anything else. I mean, nobody was strong enough to assert control. So they had to do a power sharing agreement. So the transition government, a guy named Hamid Karzai, a Durrani, was chosen as president and remained in office until 2014. So he survived all the elections, and he was succeeded by a guy named Ashraf Ghani, who's the current president. And of course, there's been lots of accusations that the elections were rigged, and they almost certainly have been. But the U.S. has consistently backed the elections, even though it's obvious there's tons of fraud, because we have to, because we need to legitimize a government. We can't afford to have, the system break down. So even if the system is flawed, we have to back those elections. And that's what we've done. So NATO created an International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, which was tasked with establishing security in until Afghanistan's government was able to take care of itself. At first, the ISAF took care of the security, and U.S. troops conducted independent operations. However, as insurgents became stronger and the Afghan government proved inept, U.S. troops were increasingly involved in helping the ISAF with their security mandate. So it appears that originally the United States was not terribly interested in the new government or anything else really except for destroying the Taliban and bin Laden, or Al-Qaeda. Pretty much, the United States originally left that up to the UN. However, as the situation deteriorated, the U.S. has increasingly, over the years, become more and more involved in the political situation. How did Pakistan deal with all this? So they were one of the main supporters of the Taliban. Well, despite having been the Taliban's biggest supporter, Pakistan had no choice but to publicly denounce them and aid the U.S. invasion. They really had no choice. Basically, to oppose the U.S. invasion would have been to pick a fight with the United States. So they switched sides. Yeah. Economically, Pakistan received huge benefits. The United States immediately lifted sanctions relating to its nuclear program and military dictatorship, and most military supplies ended up going through Pakistan ports. So it ended up as a huge stimulus package for Pakistan, even though they are the ones who created this problem in the first place. There were sanctions relating to their nuclear program, and they had just had a military coup just a year or two before that, and so there were sanctions, on them for not following democratic processes, and of course those all just went out the window. Despite public denials, there's good evidence that Pakistan has continued to covertly support the Taliban. There's Pakistan's ISI intelligence service has always been very powerful part of the government, and sometimes just kind of does its own thing. And it appears that the intelligence service has covertly supported the Taliban, possibly even up to this day. And while the main government has at least publicly supported the United States. The Pashtun population on both sides of the Durand Line has made it very easy for the Taliban to operate out of Pakistan, just as the Mujahideen did in the Soviet era. So there's this kind of fluidity to the situation where the Taliban can go back into Pakistan, regroup, come across, and that's what's been happening. There was a reactionary movement, though, to Pakistan's public support, and there's a new organization called the Pakistan Taliban, or the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP. And it's a parallel organization to the Afghan Taliban, but its agenda is to overthrow the Pakistani government for its support for the U.S. And it's been a really serious movement. Between 2005 and 2013, around 50,000 Pakistani civilians were killed as a result of terror incidents by the TTP and military operations against them. And they're still alive and well. And that's a lot of people that have been killed in this insurgency, and the Pakistan's government has been unable to put it down. So as Pakistan proved either unwilling or unable to suppress the Pakistan or Afghan Taliban, the U.S. has increasingly done its own strikes inside Pakistan, with or without permission from Pakistan. Bin Laden himself was killed in a compound very short distance from the Pakistan Military Academy, which has led to a lot of legitimate speculation that the Pakistan may have known where he was all along. That's kind of where I'm going to leave off the main history of this. I'm going to go through a few things to show some trends in Afghanistan. One way to look at this, the success of this operation, is through troop levels. So this is the years 2002 through 17, and these are the three primary troop deployments: U.S. troops, NATO troops, and Afghan security, their own guys. So in 2002, we had 7,000 U.S. troops, 4,700 and of NATO troops, and the Afghan security was just starting to get put together. So we look at the U.S. troops here. You can see there's a steady rise in troop numbers as the Taliban began to make a resurgence up until 2007. 2008, as Obama was elected, and he decided to do a troop surge, and the numbers went up to 100,000. So a massive surge. That is more guys than the Soviets ever had in Afghanistan. There's a lot of fighters, and that doesn't count the NATO troops, another 41,000, and it doesn't count private security because all the military contractors hired their own private companies to protect their guys. So that's another 100-some thousand armed security there too. Also, over this time, you had 266,000 Afghan security by that time. Okay, so then the troop numbers went back down, and that surge ended, and now we're at the end of Obama's term, we're back down to 8,400. Since Trump got elected, he has chosen to send about 5,000 troops back because the security situation is just deteriorating out of control. So now we're back up to 14,000. So 2003, we had 13,000, 5,000. And 2017, we've got 14,000 and 6,000. Very comparable numbers. Plus, we've got 331,000 of their own guys. But the problem is, the situation has gotten worse since then. It's less secure. There's more violence. This 331,000 guys are just not being effective against the Taliban. There's a lot of reasons for that. There's a ton of corruption we're going to talk about in a minute. They just don't seem to have a will to fight. One thing that happened was the Northern Alliance had they were the biggest fighting force when the government was put together, and they had mostly Tajik fighters. The Pashtun president, Karzai, was legitimately concerned that his army was Tajik, so he has tried to bring in Pashtuns to fill the ranks, and that's contributed to a dysfunctional military. Another thing that you don't see here in these numbers is that about 66% of Afghanistan's budget in 2018 was made up of foreign aid. So all these guys are getting paid for by us. So it's not just like, we just are paying for 14,000 troops. If we pull out our funds, most of this army is going to collapse anyway. So here's one way to look at the security. Go ahead.
Back on the
Yeah.
2002, was that the year that the United States actually declared war?
I don't know. I don't remember that, but I know.
We haven't actually declared war.
Yeah. But we did have 100,000 troops. Yeah. And keep in mind, there's a whole other army in Iraq over this time. Was it 2004, I think? We've had a lot more troops there.
In Afghanistan? So with the surge? Yeah.
One way to look at this deteriorating security situation is by internally displaced people. So refugees within the country. So this is from 2008 to 16. So 2008 is the troops around the time of the troop surge. As American troops have pulled down, look what's happened to the security situation. 150,000 to 1.2 million. This is just internally displaced people. There's a ton more of refugees outside. But we've got 300,000 some Afghan security forces between the army and the police and all that. And we've still got 1 million people who can't go home because they're not safe. So that's kind of gives you an idea of the way things are. There's a lot of, from what I've read in the last few years, there's now a lot of rural districts that the Taliban is the default government because the central government's lost control completely. So corruption. Kind of talked about security. This is the corruption issue. In 2018, Afghanistan was ranked 172 out of 180 countries on Transparency International's Corruption Index. So the 6th most corrupt nation on earth. It's really bad. Afghans pay an estimated $3.9 billion in bribes every year. Now, for a poor country, that's a lot of money being paid in bribes. A lot of that has to do with the opium issue, getting officials to turn a blind eye to opium production. Huge influx of international aid has created a cash bonanza within the government, and the government officials skimming off large amounts. It's well documented. And just as one example of that, in 2012, President Karzai's brother, along with other directors of the new Kabul bank, managed to divert around $5 billion, mostly foreign aid, into private offshore bank accounts. And only a couple people were actually prosecuted for it. Karzai's brother got away with it completely. This is just one of the biggest of, according to what I've read, corruption is just a way of life in the Afghan government right now. It's just the way it works. So, and we're propping this up. This is here's the opium production. This is a major factor in Afghanistan's economy. This is a graph, 1990 to 2013, of opium production. So the bars are numbers of hectaacres of opium or poppies being grown. The line is a percentage of total global cultivation. So you can see it's just gotten more. And like in 2008, 2009, they were up around 80% of all poppies or all of opium produced in the world was coming from Afghanistan. It's a huge, huge business there. Now, you might wonder, what's this dip here in 2001? Why? Well, I've read a couple of explanations for that. The reason is that the Taliban destroyed most of the crop that year. The question is why? Because they didn't do it in the years leading up. And some people say, well, the Taliban was just trying to, curry favor or something with the U.S. I don't really believe that. What one author says, he didn't really have any documentation for this, but he said that the Taliban had huge amounts of opium supplies stored up in warehouses, and they were trying to spike the market so that they could sell it at a higher price. And that makes a lot of sense to me. But in any case, since the U.S. has gotten involved, opium production has just gone through the roof. It's amazing. Now, under pressure from the United States, opium production is illegal in Afghanistan. So what this does is Afghanistan's biggest exporter, most valuable industry right now is illegal. So it's going to fund all the illegal activities, the Taliban, all kinds of organized crime. There's all these drug mafias and gun mafias and stuff that all this money is going to fund. If you take a step back, you'd think it would make sense for the government to legalize it so that they could make money off of it. But of course they can't, because the United States doesn't want that. So this is a big factor in how the insurgency is funding itself. And it's just out of control. So that kind of brings us about to the end of our history. I want to talk about some patterns of foreign invasions. So all the different foreign invasions that we've looked at, some patterns that recur between the British, the Soviets, and America. One is that regime change is easy initially, but the political situation quickly deteriorates due to corruption and incredibly complex internal politics. One of the things that has always happened when foreigners have invaded is that they failed to take into account the internal politics and tribal rivalries and stuff that go on. And like in the corruption debacle, it's being done along family lines. Like the way those guys embezzled $5 billion is they used the bank to loan money to family members who then just ran off with it. So stuff like that, it's just out of... Foreign governments have not been able to get their head around that. Foreign government ends up supporting a dysfunctional and corrupt Afghan government that is just as bad or worse than the previous one. That's been true with the British, Soviets, and us. There's a real I mean, security has gotten worse since we kicked out the Taliban. Foreign government has had to pay for the Afghan government's bills. Like I said, 66%. If you think back to the British were always having to pay for their guys' bills and army and stuff when they put somebody in power. Same thing with the Soviets. Even with foreign help, the Afghan government is unable to field an effective military. It's been true of every single time. The new government that's been put in has not been able to field an effective military. And one of the reasons for that is that any government that looks like it's being propped up by a foreigner in Afghanistan has a lot of grassroots problems of support. And the foreign presence creates a superficial economic boom in the cities that does little to help Afghanistan's long-term economy. If you remember back, we talked about like the bread crisis when the British were there. There were so many more people there all of a sudden that the price of bread went up and only the British could afford it. Local Afghans couldn't. A very similar thing happened when, just recently, in Kabul, the real estate prices, because of all these foreign aid workers coming in, the price to rent property went through the roof, and local Afghans couldn't afford it. All kinds of people coming to Kabul from other cities and as refugees couldn't find housing. Just a recurring thing you see. There's other patterns, but those are just a couple. And then, just briefly, I want to talk about a couple things about Christianity in Afghanistan today, because we want to be concerned about that. In 2019, Afghanistan is ranked by Open Doors as the second most dangerous place for a Christian, following North Korea. So, that says something. I mean, we've spent, I think it's getting upwards of $1 trillion there now, in the high billions, and you still can't be a Christian. Proselytizing and conversion to Christianity are both capital offenses, both illegal. There are no Protestant churches in Afghanistan and only one Catholic church in the Italian embassy. And of course, local Afghans are not allowed to go to that. Open Doors estimates the number of Christians in the thousands, but inaccurate numbers are not possible. The total population is about 36 million. So we've got probably, let's say even 10,000 Christians there total. That's nothing compared to 36 million people. Christianity has almost no presence in Afghanistan. One thing I do take, to put it in perspective, when Islam took over Afghanistan, it took about 500 years for Islam to get from Herat to Kabul. So this kind of thing doesn't change overnight. But someday, it's going to have to change. Christianity will take it back. Don't know how, but one little tidbit from history, the history of Christianity there. The Community Christian Church of Kabul. So after a personal request from President Eisenhower, Zaire Shah, last king, Zaire Shah's government allowed the construction of the Community Christian Church of Kabul that was completed in 1970. It was about a 10-year construction project, a very large building. It was only legal for foreigners to go there still, but it was funded by several international missionaries groups, was intended for use by aid workers and diplomats. But it ended up being a large and beautiful symbol of Christianity in Afghanistan. You might view it as it was like a foothold, Well, 3 years after its dedication, in an attempt to appease the Islamic factions, Zaire Shah ordered the building to be demolished. So, what a pity. But 3 years later. And by the way, there was a lot of marble and a lot of very nice fixtures, and the government officials who tore it down made off with all of those. And the people who paid for it were never compensated for the costs of the church either. But 1973, when that happened, was the year that the first communist coup happened, and then the rest is history from there. But that kind of wraps up our study here. There's a couple of, what I wanted to do more than anything was raise questions So in light of this history that we've talked about, I don't really have the answers, but what is the role? One question is, what is the role of Islam in Afghans' political and economic history? No doubt it's been a disaster. How much of that should be laid at the feet of Islam as a religion? Also, what is the future of Christianity in Afghanistan? What's it going to look like? I think perhaps, anyone under like 45 years old in Afghanistan has known nothing except war. Perhaps that makes an opportunity for people to start reevaluating their worldview. I don't know. Something like that. Ever since the Soviet invasion in 79, ever since then there's been either some foreign war or civil war. What will the political situation look like in 20 years or 100 years? America can't stay there forever. And it seems we're getting increasingly desperate to get out. We're even encouraging the government to make a deal with the Taliban now. So some sort of power sharing agreement between the Taliban and the government. That's not going to work, but whenever we do leave, something's going to happen. Somebody's going to come out on top. Who will it be? In 20 years, we should know that. I'd imagine, I don't know how long the United States can stay there. Maybe, 5 more years, maybe. Hopefully not. Perhaps if Trump wins the 2020 election, he'll pull out. But whoever does pull out is probably going to be held somewhat politically responsible for the disaster that's going to happen. This is going to be a disaster. So I figure maybe if Trump wins the 2020 election, he'll feel stable enough that he can actually do a withdrawal. I don't know. What about 100 years? Most of the lines in that area of Central Asia are less than 100 years old. Pakistan was formed in 1947. The Durand Line is one of the oldest lines, but that's only a little more than 100 years old now. Uzbekistan, all those countries used to be the Soviet Union, are only 30 years old maybe now. It seems inevitable there's going to be a big shakeup. What's that going to look like? One thing to keep, I'm not making a prediction, but I would say one thing to keep an eye on is China in this thing, because they've historically not been involved largely because of the Himalayas, but they've been much more active in recent years in buying up mineral contracts and stuff in Afghanistan. It's possible that they're going to be one of the next regional powers that tries to, deal with Afghanistan. Don't know, but I'd say keep your eyes on it. Lastly, what can we learn about the various types of foreign policy and their effects from the history of Afghanistan? It's definitely a study in failed foreign policy. What can we learn from it, and what would Christian foreign policy look like? A few questions to ponder from what we've talked about. Anyone have any? We don't have much time, but anyone have any thoughts or?
With Israel and Ammon, as Scripture says, the Lord instructed them not to meddle with Ammon, but the Lord still said that they could trade and buy and sell from them. So I think they weren't supposed to invade or anything like that. But I think that's the general policy for any other country. But then Ammon attacked Israel. And Israel, because I don't believe that was part of the original promised land. But when they fought back and destroyed Ammon, that was what they were supposed to do. Basically, just destroy them 100%, plunder them to compensate for the cost of war.
Mm-hmm.
They got back much more than that, though. Mm-hmm. And so it's certainly not rebuild.
Yeah.
That country in any way.
Mm-hmm. The same, if you're fighting a just war, you don't really have the responsibility to rebuild the nation.
You're supposed to plunder and compensate for your own resources. From what I understand.
Mm-hmm. So what is the proper response to a nation that's or an organization or government that's maybe not attacking us directly, but is harboring people who want to attack us? Are they a legitimate target of any kind of action, whether it's an invasion or strikes? You know, one thing that a lot of people think maybe should have happened was for the United States to just provide some air support and let the Northern Alliance do the dirty work and not get involved on the ground. The Northern Alliance, though, was in a big upheaval because they lost its main guy, Massoud, so it's uncertain whether that would have worked. Would have that been even justified, though, to try to do a regime change because, we didn't like...
None of this stuff happened in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
There's a period of time in which the United States was not being attacked, which was mostly when we were minding our own business and simply trading with people, as Dan was just saying.
Mm-hmm.
Why were we attacked in the first place was because we were doing the attacking previously.
Mm-hmm.
It was, there's great cases to be made that it was retaliation on the part of other people for the things that we had already done. And so it's kind of disingenuous for us to say, oh, we were just sitting here and now we got to go fix this.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if you take a look again at the big picture, these problems have to do with the artificial boundaries that were drawn by the British because they were colonizing these places. And they drew lines in the middle of tribes.
Yeah.
The push tunes. What's happening right now between Pakistan and India is tribal.
Right.
Because of artificial boundaries. It's one of those things where if we just mind our own business, these people would take care of these issues themselves. They would draw the boundaries where the boundaries belong. And we could simply trade with whomever, and that trade, if we're doing it honestly and forthrightly, is an evangelism of sorts, because you're trading with somebody, even if they're Muslims, Islamic, but they are seeing the advantages of trading forthrightly and in a Christian way. So,
And if you look at from the limited amount I've looked at the own writing of these people that are attacking us, we call them terrorists.
we call it terrorism.
One of their main reasons is because of our support for Israel, and we're one of Israel's hugest sponsors. So that has gotten us into a lot of this. They don't like Christianity or secular atheism or whatever. I think there is a sense in which there's an inevitable conflict between Christianity and Islam, but we've made ourselves even more of a target than we would need to be.
I'm happy to defend our positions and defend ourselves. And I was a very lonely arm in the air guy in 2002 when in a Sunday school class at the church I was going to, it was like, who's opposed to this upcoming invasion? Because it was widely broadcast that we were going to go invade Iraq. Iraq hadn't attacked us.
Yeah.
Who's in favor or who's opposed? I was the only one, right?
Yeah.
And because we were doing it preemptively, because of the supposed weapons of mass destruction that have never been found.
I know. It's funny, my dad and I were talking about that the other day, and for a couple minutes we couldn't even remember what the reason was why we invaded Iraq. And then we remembered it was the weapons of mass destruction.
It's
but
sad. The foreign policy comes back to bite us.
Yeah.
Going back to the Constitution.
Why?
In addition to why not keeping our
we are going to go over and take out this person, whoever. We're going to limit our. So there's plenty of either way.
Which was what they did with the Barbary pirates.
Correct. That's why. Yeah. That's right. Either way, it's Congress's duty. The president is not the commander in chief. He's still Congress's there.
Or issues a letter of marque.
Yeah. Let her mark that.
Okay. But you're saying that wasn't done. Did you have something, Dan?
Oh, I was just going to John said about the woman camping here, that all those friends of yours that are where we were at in favor of attacking based on them, whether they did or did not possess quote-unquote weapons of mass destruction, that still wouldn't be justified, even if they did possess them.
Well, that's correct.
Right?
We hadn't been attacked.
Possessing weapons is not a justified reason for attacking someone.
Now you're swerving into some other foreign policy, which is to say, oh, Iran, you're not allowed to have nuclear weapons. Says who?
Right.
Why?
Right, right.
You know? Yeah, exactly.
One theme, it seems, in Afghan history is that the interventions have been because of national interests. I guess if you want to call it that way. That's always been the reason, not some sort of war based off of somebody attacked somebody. That's never been the case. It's always been whoever has had a national interest in somebody else ruling Afghanistan or whatever. So, but we.
To say, thinking about this, think about this, because of Revelation, in the next chapter, it talks about Christ. In righteousness, he makes war. He makes righteous war. Think about righteous war and think about this. Have you seen any? Yeah, and thinking war, righteous war is actually a service. And I want to talk more about this next week when we talk more about foreign policy. But I read a book by a young lady who had to live in the bathroom during the whole Rwanda thing.
Uh-huh.
And how we saw war is always bad. Always. And she was living in this bathroom with like 6 other girls being protected. She was Tutsi being protected from the Hutus. She could hear them talking outside her house. Outside the house, they wanted to kill her. They knew she was in the area somewhere. And she said what she wanted to hear more than anything else in the world was the sound of gunfire. Because then she would know that somebody's come to save her. I was thinking that would be service in that case.
Yeah.
So how can we think of war as service and not as, we think of war as pure plunder. Because that's the way, that is the status way. How can we think of war as service?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, appreciate you all listening to me over this. It's been really interesting for me to study this, and hopefully we'll understand a little bit better what's going on over there. The next headline we see a little bit of the context of what's going on. But thank you.